There we are. Okay. Make sure we've got a good view for you. All right, I'm just going to do a little spiel. Very quick. My name's Alyssa Staples. I'm the assistant director here at the library. I'm pretty brand new, so I'm sure you're all very familiar faces. We know Dan is a familiar face to us. For those of you who don't know, Dan Breen is a professor of legal studies at Brandeis University. He's a longtime presenter at BFPL. Maybe many of you have seen his other talks, Great American Songs, World War I, Great Moments in Space Exploration, and I could go on and on. Thank you very much for being here once again. Dan has recently written the book on public monuments of Boston. It's expected to be published next year. I heard you chatting a little bit about it. Very exciting. And I just want to give a great big thank you to the friends at the Bedford Free Public Library who makes this lecture series possible for us. And also thanks to a very generous donation by Judy C. Tody in memory of Norman E. Tody. So everyone enjoy your afternoon with Dan. Please help yourself to refreshments. And I'll be Oh, and don't forget, we've got puzzles for sale for the friends. It's a great pastime to do in this Arctic weather. And they range in price from around 50 cents to $1. Thanks again for being here and enjoy.
Great to see everybody. So many old friends from my past years here at Bedford. We are talking today about the Portland Gale of 1898, a topic that takes on a bit of tragic poignancy, considering the fate of the Lily Jean fishing vessel out of Gloucester. I believe 7 were on board that perished in the waves. And in this gale, many more, as a matter of fact, suffered a similar fate. We'll talk about some of them. And in regard to some of the stories of those who were caught out there in the Atlantic during the terrible gale of 1898, if you want to read more about it, this is a pretty good source. Cape Cod in the Portland Gale, the Gale of 1898 by Don Wilding. So it's a history press. If you want to read more about it, it's readily available, and I certainly commend it. I've taken some material from this book, but if I make any mistakes or misstatements, it's not Don Wilding's fault, it's clearly my fault. So keep that in mind. But we are going to be talking about the Great Gale of 1898, always called the Portland Gale, and we'll see why that is in a minute. A very memorable storm. We all remember some storms and winters and terrible weather events in our recent past, especially maybe for our purposes, the long snow of 2015, when there I was in the Back Bay. I was trying to go down Boylston Street and make a left turn on Charles Street from Arlington Street. It took me 45 minutes to do that, even though it takes about 30 seconds to walk because of all the piled up snow on the sides. We all have stories about these storms. Who can forget, for example, the great blizzards of 1717, when 4 great blizzards fell in rapid succession, burying eastern Massachusetts in 30 feet of snow? Who can forget the Great Gale of 1804, which blew off the steeple of the Old North Church, among a lot of other things, as a matter of fact, or the Gale of 1841, which tore off the roof of King's Chapel and also took the lives of 57 sailors and fishermen in Truro. Truro was never really the same again after that gale. And today, we are talking about a gale that had a similar effect on the city of Provincetown, the town of Provincetown, and that's where we're going to begin, if all goes well here. Here is Provincetown, the way it looked in 1898. And a lot of this story has to do with Provincetown because the worst of the gale was swirling, as we'll see, just to the north of the primary fishing port on Cape Cod. Back in 1898, Provincetown really was one of the centers of the fishing industry on the East Coast, one of the premier fishing ports on the East Coast, and it had been for some time. There were almost 50 wharves in Provincetown, most of them dedicated to fishermen who used that as their home port. Provincetown was so dedicated to fishing that in the 18th century, when the legislature was officially incorporating this after the Revolution as a town, they thought of calling it Harrington, after herrings. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed, and it took the old name of Provincetown, which it remains to this day. Until 1835, Provincetown was so dedicated to the Atlantic and the harbor and all things fishing that there were literally no streets in Provincetown. Nobody saw any need to have streets in Provincetown. If you wanted to get anywhere, you went down to the beach and you just walked along the beach. Or if you needed to get to a school or a church, there were little footpaths. But there were no streets until finally Provincetown in 1835 at a town meeting, and they voted to fund some streets. But a lot of people in Provincetown thought that was a terrible waste of money. And some of them were so upset about the fact that they got to pay taxes to support streets that they decided they would never use it. They would just walk on the sidewalk, if at all. And some of them did that for the rest of their lives, even though there were now streets in Provincetown. For most of the 19th century, that's the way it was. It's a town dedicated to the sea and fishing. The other big industry in Provincetown was salt manufacture, which was a great tradition on Cape Cod. What you would do is you'd amass a lot of seawater and then pile it in a bunch of successive vats going like this, usually going downhill, if that was possible. And what would happen is over time, of course, the water would evaporate. You'd be left with the salt. And 150 gallons of seawater could produce a nice bushel of valuable salt. That's how people made a living, among other things, around Provincetown, until there was a lot of competition in the salt trade from upstate New York. And that left fishing as the primary trade. And that was still true in the late 19th century. Most people in Provincetown, one way or another, had something to do with the fishing trade, either out of the Atlantic or maybe processing fish once everything came back to port. There was a bit of a decline in the fishing trade in Provincetown by 1898. Bigger commercial trawlers were beginning to take a lot of share of the trade. And a lot of those trawlers really couldn't use Provincetown anymore. What they needed was a bigger port like Gloucester. But although the fishing trade was in decline, that's still what most people did, even by 1898. Is the sound being a little distracting? Because we've never used this before.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, I don't think we're allowed to do that. But
Would you like to try the hand
yes. Oh, well, yeah, if it's distracting to the audience, I'll try that.
Well, no one is using the assistive devices. We
Oh,
can
then I
try
don't need it.
without the microphone.
Then I won't need a microphone.
Let's try it without, and if you all can hear it, we'll go.
Well, they're used to me without the microphone.
Yeah, okay, good.
Okay, so back to begin our story again from Provincetown. So as of 1898, what most fishermen would do in Provincetown is they'd be up towards the Grand Banks following cod, or what was left of the cod trade up there. Or more likely, by the late 19th century, what they were doing is following the mackerel from the waters off Cape Cod all the way up to Nova Scotia. So mackerel fishing was the big industry around Provincetown especially. And there was a bit of a decline in it for a while because the mackerels caught on. And they began to go west in the Atlantic, and they tried to bypass Cape Cod until a Provincetown fisherman named Josiah Chase actually thought to go onto the Western Atlantic, and he was over there by South Africa, and he found the mackerel. And as soon as he found the mackerel said to themselves, well, if Chase found us over here, we might as well go back to Cape Cod. We'll get caught sooner rather than later. We're going to get caught eventually. And so by 1898, the mackerel were back, and things were not going badly, although the trade was a bit past its height. And that was the Provincetown, as you see here, 1898, filled with fishing vessels there in the harbor. Although the salt makers were out of business, still a pretty profitable port. So here we are, November 26th, 1898. It's the Saturday after Thanksgiving. It would have seemed to most people to be a normal day that Saturday afternoon. But people on Cape Cod noticed something different, attuned to the weather as they were. The sky was taking on a certain kind of glassy look. And as the day went by, morning and the afternoon of November 26th, things got murkier around Cape Cod in the islands. The gulls were where they usually were, hanging out, but they weren't screaming like they usually were, which could be nothing but a bad sign. What's wrong with the gulls? What they did not know on Cape Cod was that there were weather conditions that very much had to be worried about. We have a meteorologist in the audience who can add to any wrong thing that I happen to say. But what was going on was there was a storm system, a winter storm system coming down from the north, approaching the east coast, the Alberta Clipper. So a classic Alberta Clipper. So it's coming down towards the mid-Atlantic, and a little bit north of Virginia, it collided with a system of moist air, making its way up from the south. And that itself is something to worry about. But what was going to make this even worse, that as this system of heavy winds and snow began to make its way towards the northeast, it was going to join a very low, very difficult low pressure system hanging around the Cape. And that was going to mean heavy winds, rising winds, and now what you got is a pretty serious gale. But the Weather Bureau, still relatively in its infancy in the late 19th century, didn't understand how bad this offshore gale was about to hit.
And so what warnings were issued by late afternoon on Saturday talked about heavy blizzard, but that's about it. Nothing about a world historic gale, which was something this was pretty close to. Something to worry about, but nothing to cause terrible undue alarm. And that was the case by the afternoon of November 26th. You've got this very, very dangerous system developing on its way past Long Island towards Cape Cod. And probably much less warning than anybody would ever get about something like this, of course, today. And it so happened, you probably caught on to this, that it's November 26th. And that means it was 2 days after Thanksgiving. And it happened that many people from the coast of Maine had decided to come down to Boston to see relatives for Thanksgiving. And now it's Saturday and it's time to go back. It's time to go back home. Many of them would have bought a ticket on the Boston and Maine Railroad to go up to Portland and points north or wherever they happen to be. But that wasn't the best way to go. If you could get on board, the better way to go was this, the SS Portland, built in the Bath shipyard in 1889, a classic night boat. And if you're not familiar with that term, the night boats were boats that went between different locales on the East Coast, in this case, Boston and Portland. You leave one port at night, and then you go overnight, and you get to where you wanted to go in the morning. It's a lovely way to go. You'd board around sundown. You'd have a nice dinner, maybe some dancing in the saloon, have a nice old time for yourself, and then you would go to sleep and you'd wake up about the time of your destination. This is the Portland. We'll get back to that in a minute. The greatest of the night boats, though, was the Priscilla in the Commonwealth, beloved by generations of Bostonians and New Yorkers. For these boats, you get on a special boat train at South Station, and then you go on the train to Fall River, and you get on the night boat in Fall River, and then you'd have a nice time for yourself through Long Island Sound. You go to sleep, and you wake up on the East River, about to go around the Battery to the Hudson. And then you go vice versa if you wanted to go back. 300 staterooms were on the Priscilla alone. And I'll give you one idea about the luxurious conditions on the ship. That's what the saloon looked like on the Fall River. So there are the rooms on either side. And you go relax on the bottom and look out at the skylight on top. Just beautiful. And before we leave, the Fall River line, Priscilla, Commonwealth, back and forth between Fall River and New York. And if you have some money, that's how you want to go to Newport on the Fall River line. I did want to, maybe I can't sing, but I'll give you the lyrics to a famous song about the Fall River line. And it goes like this. It was written in 1913. It was a big hit in 1913. And it goes something like this. It's kind of bad. It's not a nice song, but it goes like this. On the old Fall River line, on the old Fall River line, I fell for Susie's line of talk, and Susie fell for mine. Then we fell in with a parson, and he tied us tight as twine. But I wish, oh Lord, I fell overboard on the old Fall River line. It's not nice. I'm sorry about that. Now the Portland was not as luxurious as that, but it did have a saloon like this with a skylight. It was just a lot smaller. The Portland itself was a bit smaller than the Priscilla in the Commonwealth, probably about a little less than 300 feet is how long the SS Portland was. But if you get on the Portland, as many people love to do, and this is what a ticket would look like for the SS Portland, you would see that glass skylight, and you would see richly carved mahogany furniture throughout the vessel. Cherry wood would line the walls in first-class cabins. You spend about $4 for a nice first-class cabin. There were velvet carpet along the hallways. And then you get to the cheaper cabins a little bit below, and they would cost about $1 for overnight. Still not bad, not unaffordable for many people. And that's what most of the passengers probably did. Not lined in those cabins with cherry wood, not like first class, lined by good New England white pine usually, but still a pretty nice place to be. So here's the Portland. I'll give you another picture of it, and we'll talk more about it in a second. But that Saturday, November 26, 1898, a lot of people were going home for Thanksgiving, so the Portland was going to be almost full, not quite, almost full, but night boat on the way back to Portland. And among the passengers who were boarding towards the late afternoon, early evening of November 26th, were two sisters from Weymouth who were on their way to Portland to attend the funeral of the third sister who had recently passed away. Another was a German immigrant. His name was Louis Silverstein. He worked in Portland, but his family was still in Boston. So he had come to Boston for Thanksgiving, and now he was going back. And this time he was going to take back to his apartment in Portland his 5-year-old son, Harry. And Harry had on him, as they boarded the Portland, a nice dark blue coat that his grandfather had just given him. Also not on board that Saturday was George Heald and his wife and their 7-month-old baby. They had been visiting Cambridge for Thanksgiving, and they were going to go home that Saturday. They had a ticket on the Portland, but luckily their family convinced them, oh, please stay an extra day, go back on Sunday. And so they did. They finally gave in. One of the last to board the Portland, and this is just a little bit before 7 p.m., was a guy named Lewis Metcalf, who was just down for Thanksgiving. As he approached the gangplank, his friend, who was saying goodbye, said, maybe you should rethink this. I hear the forecast is not so good. There's a blizzard out there. And Metcalf turned to his friend and said, don't worry, maybe I get seasick. That's the worst thing that's going to happen to me. And on the Portland he went. And it might have been just then, according to a guy named Gott, who lived out on the Bull Hill Peninsula in Maine, who was going to go up the gangplank to board the Portland. It might have been just then that a mother cat with her kittens scurried down the gangplank back to India Wharf, where the Portland was tied up. And according to the story he told the papers, God said, if the cat is worried, so am I. And he decided not to get on the Portland. I don't know if that's true. I suspect he kind of made that up. But it's still a good story. And we know that animals are pretty good at detecting changes in barometric pressure. So it may well be that that's true. I don't know. Speaking of those who were there on the Portland, was a guy named Leo Lawler, who he and his friend were going to go up to Portland. And they both got on the ship in time to leave a little bit after 7. But at the last second, Leo turned to his friend and said, you know what, we probably need some whiskey for the trip. So he ran down the gangplank because he knew there was a liquor store by India Wharf where he could buy a pint. He got the whiskey, he ran back to the gangplank, and the Portland was 15 feet away from the wharf by then, and he couldn't board. And the last thing he remembers was his friend on the stern of the Portland pointing at him and laughing at him because he cared more about whiskey than the Portland than his trip. On one of the very rare occasions when whiskey actually saved a life and didn't do the opposite. So he was able to live. The other guy who didn't get on the Portland was the barber of the Portland. He was a guy named Comer, and he'd heard the weather forecast. And he knew from experience that people did not like getting shaves in heavy seas. That is not a pleasant experience. And he figured he was not going to get any business anyway, so he decided not to board, and so his life was saved as well. So that's the scene, Saturday of November 26, 1898. And back to the Portland, it was, of course, a steamship, as you see here, and it was a side wheeler, which meant that both sides of the Portland had these big side wheels that were turned by steam-powered engines. And you can see the engine, used to call it a walking beam or vertical beam engine. You can see it right there in the middle, this thing going up and down like that, turning the wheels as the boiler went. These were pretty good on rivers. They're very common on rivers, but I think you can see for yourself what the difficulty with a side wheeler was going to be. Remember, there are 2 wheels on each side, a wheel on each side, in heavy seas out on the Atlantic. Because if you've got waves, and if the waves are going 10, 20 feet, maybe more than that, then what's always going to happen is one of the wheels is going to be up above the water, and the other wheel is going to be below the water even further. And remember, they're both connected by the same drive shaft, which means that the engine is trying to turn them at what the engine wants to be, a proper, consistent rate of speed. But this wheel is going faster, the other wheel is going slower because one is out of the water, one's in the water. And that's going to put an awful lot of stress on any engine if that goes on too long. That was always the problem with these side wheelers. But as long as the water was fairly calm, your typical conditions out in the Atlantic, even in winter, these things were okay. In the SS Portland had never had too much of a problem with their engines, so maybe not a whole lot of people thought much about it. I did want to mention that this is the most famous rendering of the SS Portland, a ship known to everybody in Boston who had any business in Maine with family or commercial life. He took it all the time. It's done by a special artist who did almost nothing but steamship drawings because that's how he made his living, a guy named Samuel Ward Stanton. Stanton was so regarded as an artist of steamships that a few years later, in the early 20th century, the Hudson River Day Boat Line which ran ships between Albany and New York, hired him to go to Europe and paint pictures, make drawings of all the different places in Europe where Washington Irving had been. Because the Albany Hudson Day Boat Line was going to commission a new ship, the Washington Irving, and they wanted all these different cabins and staterooms to look like Washington Irving scenes. So Stanton, famous steamship artist, went all the way to Europe. He went to the Alhambra in Spain because Washington Irving wrote about that, and he made pictures. He went to London, made pictures there. Everywhere Washington Irving went, he went, had all these wonderful drawings. And then once he had all the drawings ready, Stanton figured it was time to come home and present them to the owners of the Washington Irving. And he was all done by April of 1912, and he got on the Titanic. So on the way home on the Titanic he goes, and that's why we don't know what those drawings look like, because they all went down with him into the Atlantic Ocean. The Washington Irving, though, went into commission, and it lasted very well, very popular ship between Albany and New York. You leave Albany, I think usually late at night, and you get into New York just 12 hours later. Or maybe it's the opposite, but you get the idea. But they did commission the Washington Irving, and it did fairly well for many years until finally in 1926 it sank right above the Holland Tunnel. And that's where it lay for many years until they salvaged it. But anyway, nobody was thinking much of the vulnerabilities of those side wheelers, I think, because not many people knew how bad this storm was. In fact, nobody in Boston really knew how bad this storm was. All we know is that the 59-year-old captain of the SS Portland was not the sort of person to take undue risks. So India Wharf is up in the upper left-hand part of this map. So picture Hollis Blanchard, the captain of the SS Portland, getting everything ready to go on Saturday night, November 26th. One of the last things he did was check in with the Weather Bureau, and the Weather Bureau gave him everything they knew at the time. As a blizzard off the coast, here's where it is. It's approaching Cape Cod. And I think Blanchard probably felt if he left on time, a little bit after 7, he could just outrun the thing, and he would get up to Portland and everything would be fine. Later on, the story was that the agent of the Portland Steamship Company, Blanchard's employer, took him aside and said, "We don't think you should go. We're worried about those conditions out there." And Blanchard disobeyed orders and went out anyway. I can't imagine that. There's no way a captain in the employ of that steamship line is just going to go after being told not to. I think that agent made that up after the fact to make the steamship line look a little bit better. I figured they all decided that it's worth the risk and we should all be going. Hollis Blanchard, if he had known what it was like out there, this guy's from Belfast, Maine. He knew the ocean. He'd been on the ocean all his life. I can't believe he ever would have gone. There was just no way in Boston to know how bad things were. Blanchard and the steamship line, they probably also understood that if there was any way to go, you should go. Nobody wanted to cancel a trip. That would put the schedule behind schedule, Portland, Boston, Portland, Boston. So if you could go, you would want to go. You wanted your steamship line to have the prestige of not canceling voyages, always getting people where they needed to go. And so there was that consideration as well. And therefore, the Portland would leave as usual. A little bit before 7:20, between 7 and 7:20, from India Wharf, somewhere around 200 people on board. And as he had done many times before, he backed away from India Wharf, turned around, began heading towards the Harbor Islands. And by now, by the time they're out around the Harbor Islands, it was beginning to snow a little bit in Boston Harbor. And they got by Boston Light on Great Brewster Island, as they always did. The lightkeeper on Boston Light, a guy named Harry Pingree, saw the Portland go, and he turned to his wife and he said, "It's going to be a lot of seasick people on that ship tonight. Mark my words." No sooner had they passed Little Brewster Island than the wind began to pick up a bit more, the snow began to fall a bit harder, and shortly after that, now they're in Massachusetts Bay, 2 ships passed them heading into Boston Harbor, and both of them had been on the way to Maine, and they decided to turn back because they were worried about what they were seeing out there in the Atlantic. And one of them was the Kennebec, the other was the Mount Desert. One of them, I think the Kennebec, blew a bunch of whistles warning the Portland to go back. If the whistles were heard, they had no effect. The Portland just kept going. Conditions were worse and worse as they got into Massachusetts Bay, and then customarily, as he always did, Blanchard in the Portland took a turn to port to the left, and they're heading eventually past Cape Ann on the way to Portland. By that point, The closer they got to Cape Ann, the worse things were getting out there. A fishing schooner, late at night, into the early hours of Sunday, did see the Portland with all the lights on a bit past Thatcher Island. This is the Thatcher Island light, just off Rockport, the Cape Ann Peninsula. And that was the last definitive sighting of the Portland by that fishing vessel, which was doing everything it could to get into Gloucester before things got bad. Now, things were not good out there in the ocean. Here we are early Sunday. The gale was really picking up, early hours of the morning, but not impossible. And probably Blanchard thought, hoping maybe against hope, that experienced sailor that he was, he could still outrun this storm and maybe get to Portland. But at that time, early hours of Sunday morning, things were very bad indeed further south, where the gale was pretty much at its height by the early hours of Sunday before sunup. Just off Montauk Point in Long Island were two colliers, two big schooners carrying coal up the coast from Pennsylvania to New England. There were hundreds of ships in that trade, and these were two of them. The Pace and the Hanscom, they would have looked something like that, a coal-carrying schooner. The captains of these ships were old friends. They were sailing north towards New England in sight of one another off Montauk when the storm overtook them. The wind and the waves were unmanageable pretty quickly. And as it became clear how serious this was, the captains of each of those ships instructed their crewmen to lash themselves to the mast or to the railings, which is what you do when the wind is so bad, you're worried about being blown overboard. And so they were lashed, many of them to the riggings. And we know that because months later, divers off Montauk found the wrecks and the skeletal remains of those sailors still lashed to the masts. After midnight now, things were getting very bad indeed around Cape in the islands. Fishing vessels were desperately trying to put into port. And if they could make it to Provincetown, that's what they did. Dozens and dozens of vessels, wherever they happened to be. If they were anywhere near the Cape, many of them tried to get into Provincetown. And about 30 of them did, where they were now buffeted by extreme winds and snow, so that many of them began colliding with one another in Provincetown Harbor in nearby. Some of them grounded on shoals, some of them grounded on the beach, but anything was better than being out in the Atlantic in conditions like this. Wind, some of those gusts by now, by the early hours of Sunday, were 90 miles an hour. Of course, in those conditions, nobody can dock. Nobody can tie to a wharf when the winds are like that. And that's why they were jostling with each other, buffeted against each other, hurled upon the shore. It was a disaster area, a developing one around Provincetown as the night developed. Now, one of the ships trying to find shelter anywhere on Cape Cod, in this case in the inner bay, Cape Cod Bay, was a ship called the Mary Taylor. And the Mary Taylor was carrying produce from North Carolina up to New England. The captain of the Mary Taylor was a young man, North Carolinian, grew up in the Outer Banks, knew about the ocean. It's a guy named Alan Bragg. Conditions were so bad, he was no longer able to make control of the ship as the winds were picking up and waves are 20 to 30 feet by now. And what he had to do was, at all costs, try to find shelter. He was in Cape Cod Bay, but he simply couldn't control the ship. The ship broke apart in Cape Cod Bay, broke in half. And poor Captain Bragg found himself lashed to one part of the ship, and the ship was, the rigging was attached to the mast where he was lashed, and is going into the water, then out of the water, into the freezing water, out of the water. He never thought he'd survive. He was probably making his peace with God when all of a sudden, as soon as the conditions were still awful, when the sun came up, you could barely tell the sun came up, but as soon as anybody could, no matter how bad the conditions were, guys from Brewster saw the plight of the Mary Taylor, and they rowed out to where he was, and they found Captain Bragg, and they got him out of the rigging, and they saved his life. And he was so impressed by the rescue of the Mary Taylor, by the people of Brewster, that this North Carolinian, Captain Alan Bragg, decided, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stay here in Brewster. He never went back to North Carolina. He got married in Brewster, and it was said of him that if there was such a thing as a true Cape Codder whose ancestors were not here with the Pilgrims, then it was Captain Bragg of North Carolina. And if you go to Brewster now and you play golf, the second hole is named after him, Captain Alan Bragg. Further north now, It's about 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m. Storm is terrible at those hours on Sunday. Any ship that was anywhere near Boston Harbor was trying to get in, maybe at best, maybe to go ashore somewhere because they're never going to dock with these kinds of winds. But a lot of ships were trying to find some shelter in Boston Harbor. Not an easy thing to do. We got 70-mile-an-hour winds, not unroutine at all by now. You got to avoid all those harbor islands. It's dangerous to try to go in, but it's even more dangerous to stay out of the ocean. So that's what a bunch of those ships were doing. So many tried to get into the harbor, and one of them was a schooner called the Calvin Baker. So the Calvin Baker is making its way into the harbor against the winds, and it ran aground right by Little Brewster Island, right by the lighthouse. The ship began to sink. The only thing the crew could think to do was crawl into a tiny part of the forward deck that was still lingering above water. They began sheltering there, several of them. They began screaming for help, although what could people do? They screamed for help anyway, the snow biting relentlessly against them through the open space between themselves and the water on that forward part of the deck, hoping against hope for some rescue. And it said that their screams were so piteous that the wife of the assistant lightkeeper on Great Brewster Island died of shock and sadness upon hearing their cries and knowing there was nothing to be done about it. Finally, one of the crew members there on the Calvin Baker, he couldn't take it anymore. He figured they were going to die anyway. So he volunteered to swim in the freezing water to try to get to Great Brewster Island. They told him, you can't do it, that's suicide. But he tried to do it anyway. He said, we're going to die anyway. Maybe I can take a line from the ship, tie it up to the shore. Maybe we can all take the line and get to where we need to go. But into the water he went, and he didn't last more than a few minutes. Down under he went, one of the many casualties of that terrible night. And all of the crew members of the Calvin Baker at that point thought they were done for. You see, that's it. Nobody's going to be able to get to us. But they didn't count on the most famous lifesaver, probably in all New England history, who is still alive in 1898, although he was in his 70s. And it was that guy there. So that is the man who was about to come to their rescue. That is Joshua James. Joshua James was the head of the life-saving station down at Point Allerton by Hull, Massachusetts, some miles to the south of where Great Brewster is. And during that terrible night, he got his lifesavers together, and despite the appalling conditions, they piled into a life-saving boat, began to row into the harbor, into the teeth of the wind in the snow. And they got to the Calvin Baker, and despite everything, they were able to rescue most of the crew of the Calvin Baker who were seeking shelter there in the forward part of the ship. And that wasn't all. Joshua James exhausted himself. He's in his 70s in that life-saving boat. This is probably what the boat looked like. It was something like that. They're rowing in the harbor. Nobody would have blamed him if they'd gone back to Hull with the survivors and just stayed where they were. But that wasn't him. He insisted on going back out. Went back out. He rescued in his crew a total of 20 people from 4 ships who otherwise would have gone to the bottom. He rescued them that terrible night, including a couple from a ship called the Lucy Nichols, who were stranded on a desolate piece of rock called Black Rock, right off Cohasset, would clearly have died of exposure, but he got to them, he rescued them, and a grand total of 20 lived to see their families who otherwise would have had it not been for Joshua James. Joshua James became a lifesaver because while he was living in Hull, he saw his mother's ship. His mother was on the ship coming into the harbor. A rogue wave took the ship, wrecked the ship, and he knew his mother was on the ship. He watched his mother die out there in the Atlantic at the age of 10 years old. And he decided, I'm going to be a lifesaver. And so he spent the rest of his life, as soon as he was trained as a lifesaver, and he eventually died of a heart attack just a few years after the Portland Gale, training other lifesavers. He had just gone to the beach after an arduous training session. He turned back to the lifesavers from the beach, and he said, good job, boys, you're doing fine. Then he turned around and died right there on the beach. And very appropriately, he was buried in a life-saving vessel. So that's where his grave is. His casket is a life-saving rowboat. In the early hours of the evening, things were probably at their worst for the Portland. Now we're back to the SS Portland. This is what it would have looked like. Early hours of Sunday, getting into dawn, 5, 6, 7 a.m. Captain Blanchard would have been feverishly trying to keep that ship on course to Portland, keep it going to the north as best it could. But we'll never know what happened that Sunday morning. Where he was between Cape Ann and Cape Cod, 30-foot waves would have been increasingly common. Higher waves as rogue waves, particularly dangerous. It may be that the boilers failed, unable to adjust to the constant rising and falling of those paddle wheels. It could be that he lost power entirely, boilers out, maybe the electricity's out. It could be that the winds blew him to the south. It could be that he, at long last, tried to turn around. And while he still had power, maybe tried to make it either to Cape Cod Bay or Boston Harbor. But we'll never know. All we know is that the end must have been terrible for the SS Portland. Engulfed by waves, seawater everywhere, freezing cold, driving snow, heavy blizzard conditions. Waves at some point at the height of the storm, probably about 60 feet. Just hard to imagine, 60-foot waves out there, completely towering over the SS Portland. All we know for sure in those terrifying circumstances is that around 9 a.m., all the watches of the people on the Portland stopped. The watches say 9:15. So whatever happened, probably everybody went under between 9 and 9:15. And where they went under was at a spot, the Stellwagen Bank. It's like 25, 30 miles east of Boston, a little bit north of Cape Cod. And that's where the wreck is. That's where the wreck lies to this day. The pride of the Portland Steamship Company. For long afterward, after 1912, this was referred to as the Titanic of New England. And that's why the great storm that took this ship has always been called the Portland Gale, named after the SS Portland. We'll never know how many people died. The manifest of the Portland was kept on ship. There wasn't anything on land. We'll never know how many died. Probably between 190 and 200, but we're not quite sure. But this is what we know. This was the deadliest shipwreck in the long annals of New England shipwrecks. The deadliest single loss of life of any shipwreck in New England history. It's the SS Portland in 1898. And a particular poignancy and particular sadness is the fact that among those who died, never came back, were several dozen African Americans from Portland who were members of the Abyssinian Church on Newbury Street in Portland. There were a little over 300 African Americans in Portland, so a little over a tenth of them died on this ship, the SS Portland. This is their church, the Abyssinian Meeting House on Newbury Street. Because of this death toll, the church didn't last much longer than 1898. It ceased to be a congregation after several more years. And now they're trying to restore this church. And if all goes well, this church, which dates from before the Civil War, which once resounded with the speeches of William Lloyd Garrison and other abolitionists, may once more be a place you can visit, and may once more perhaps be a place where services are held. We'll have to see. Meanwhile, that horrible Sunday, ships continued to bunch together in the chaos of Provincetown Harbor. Morning into the afternoon of Sunday, the gale still raged. We're talking about something like a 36-hour gale with the Portland Gale. And that meant that the men of the Wood End Life-Saving Service now had a very difficult job to do. So here's Provincetown, of course. You're all familiar with right there. Wood End is here. And there was a life-saving station there where men now, despite the fact that the winds were against them when they were trying to get into the harbor, had to find a way to push one of their life-saving boats into the harbor to save anybody among those 30-odd vessels in Provincetown Harbor whose men could not get on shore, and many of whom were lashed to the rigging. And in those circumstances, in those conditions, they had to be saved, and they had to be saved quickly. So in these horrific conditions, the men of the Woods End Life-Saving Station began dragging their longboat, pushing, dragging, trying to get it into the water. And it took hours just to get this thing in the water. But they heard so many shouts and they saw the distress signals and they knew they had to go. So into Provincetown Harbor, finally, in these horrible conditions, they were able to get their boat into the water. And the first ship they found was the Lester Lewis, which wasn't nothing much more than a mast and some rigging hanging above the water. And they saw people on the rigging, and they rowed madly to get to them. And they got to these sailors who lashed themselves to the rigging, but it was too late. They'd frozen to death. They'd frozen to death on the rigging during the night. But they didn't give up. They went to the next ship, and the next ship was the Jordan Mott. And there were other men in the rigging, about 3/4 dead, but they were still alive. And the lifesavers got to them, and they got them onto the ship, and they got them back to shore. And the men afterwards said what is true. We never thought mortal men could even get a boat into the harbor until we saw those lifesavers. And of course, they were grateful to them as long as they lived. Meanwhile, and this is the most famous story of the Portland Gale probably, in Provincetown itself, Commercial Street was covered in water, probably up to your knees by then. Now we're into the late morning, early afternoon of Sunday. It's hard to get around at all in Provincetown. But an old whaler named Lavender, Robert Lavender, made his way through the water-strewn streets, through the howling wind and the gale and the snow. And he began shouting at the top of his lungs among the fishermen he could round up, "I need volunteers, I need volunteers." And this is what he said: "Men, we know there has to be some of us out there in the rigging, in the harbor. It's a life, mate, the fishing life. It's a life, mate, and I'm gonna go try to get out to them. I call for volunteers." And the fishermen raised their hands. "We'll go, we'll go." They need a boat. They got to a repair shop just about a block away. They commandeered a boat in the repair shop, close to a life-saving boat, the kind that you might see at the life-saving services. And they all piled into this boat. They put it into the water. The wind, at this point in Provincetown, was at their backs, luckily. So they could get the boat in the water better than those other guys could at the other end of the harbor. And no sooner had they got into the heavy waves of the harbor, going up and down like this, than a heavy wave struck the boat. And Lavender, 52-year-old Robert Lavender, was washed overboard into the harbor. He bobbed down, and then he bobbed up, and he shouted at the top of his lungs, "Leave me, leave me. Go to those in trouble, leave me, I'll be okay, I'll swim to shore." And the guys on the boat yelled at him, "The hell you were, the hell you gotta get to shore." And they threw out an oar. The oar's like, what, 15, 20 feet maybe? These are big oars. They put down an oar, he grabbed hold of it, they pulled him on board, they rescued him, and everybody on shore is cheering and cheering at the top of their lungs as they rescued him. And then they began rowing up into the harbor, and they began saving people who they could, anybody they could reach. And at the end of it, by the time everything was done, they'd saved almost a dozen people out there in Province Harbor, including a guy named William Forrest. And this is probably good advice if you ever find yourself in this situation. William Forrest was up in the rigging of the F.H. Smith fishing vessel, the F.H. Smith. So he's up in the rigging, but he wasn't lashed. What he was doing was climbing up and down, up and down. His hands were frozen, but he's still doing it. And that was to conserve body heat. And he figured he might be okay if I just keep climbing. And they got to him, and Lavender yelled, dive into the water, we'll fish you out." And that's what he did, and they rescued him and many others before they got back to the harbor. Now that Sunday, storms unabated, another fishing vessel, a schooner called the Albert Butler, could not make it into Provincetown. So a bunch of these ships were out here, and that's not a good place to be under any circumstances, because that's by the Peaked Hill sand dunes, the sandbars of Peaked Hill. One of the most dangerous parts of the whole East Coast was right there on this part of the Cape, on the outer Cape. The ships were beginning to run aground on those sandbars. And one of the ships that ran aground, because they couldn't get around into Cape Cod Bay, was the Albert Butler. Onto the sandbar it goes, begins to break apart. They put up distress signals. People knew there were guys out there on the Albert Butler offshore on the sandbar. The waves here were routinely 20 feet high at that point. And the fishermen nearby in that part of the Cape couldn't possibly get out against it. Waves like that. They didn't have the right equipment. But what they did have was a life-saving station, and they had a Lyle gun. So the idea was to shoot with the Lyle gun a line out to where the Albert Butler was. And maybe somebody could grab hold of the line, attach it to the ship, and then climb on the line and just go like this to shore, past the sandbar onto the beach. So that's what they did. The lifesavers, this is the best they could do, shot the line out to the Albert Butler. A sailor on the Albert Butler grabbed it, but he was too frozen or maybe too weak or exhausted to properly tie it to the Albert Butler. And so instead, he couldn't tie it, and the line pulled him back, pulled him onto shore individually. And it didn't look like anything probably was going to work. And it was to the great sorrow of those who were trying to find the Lyle gun that they decided nobody can survive it. They're all just going to die. There's nothing we can do. Terrible thing. But it was to their great surprise and delight that when the storm had passed its peak, a little bit later, now late on Sunday, now it's low tide, a couple guys were seen bedraggled, barely alive, walking over the sandbar through the much lower water now, then onto the beach. They were the survivors of the Albert Butler. Others had died, but they survived. And the interesting thing about this story is one of these guys, one of these two who managed to get on shore, had been able to save his parrot. And the lifesavers saw two guys in a parrot come onto the beach. And the parrot started issuing an unbelievable tide of profanity that they could hear over the waves of the wind. And that was all that was left, the living crew of the Albert Butler. Further south, Martha's Vineyard, of course, was in the path of the storm. This is by Vineyard Haven in the northern part of Martha's Vineyard. 26 vessels sought shelter, more than that, sought shelter in Vineyard Haven. But 26 of them, 26 of the vessels that sought shelter were later determined to be total losses. So the wreckage in Provincetown was terrible. And the wreckage in Vineyard Haven was, if anything, even worse. Ships were colliding against each other in the waves, destroying each other. But it's better than being out there, of course, in the Atlantic. So they took the risk. One of the schooners trying to get around East Chalk, like you see up there, they were trying to get around that head to try to get into Vineyard Haven, what's called the Island City. And try as they might, they couldn't get around that point of land. And they were wrecked just offshore. And frantic residents over here by Oak Bluffs in the Vineyard Highlands, they were watching all this, as best they could make it through the snow and the dismal conditions. They were watching the last struggles of the island city. And it was so traumatic and so difficult, and they regretted so much that those men couldn't get into Vineyard Haven. Now, what the people of that part of Martha's Vineyard eventually did was something that maybe would ensure that something this bad wouldn't happen again. And what they decided to do was widen this little inlet here that goes into a pond. And that's Oak Bluffs Harbor. And that way, to this day, today, if this happens to you as a ship, you can make it into that pond. Whereas in 1898, you probably couldn't, would have been impossible. So the geography of Martha's Vineyard changed because of the residents' determination to do the best they could for future generations of sailors. Struggling to stay afloat in Vineyard Haven were a couple of tugboats that maybe thought they could assist in rescue efforts. Many ships could not get into the haven. Distress signals were going up off Martha's Vineyard. And a bunch of the people on Martha's Vineyard decided we need to do something to save those we can off Martha's Vineyard. And three men who became heroes, their names were Frank Goldart, Isaac Norton, and Alvin Cleveland, decided that they were going to take out a dory, like a fishing dory, and to swim out offshore Martha's Vineyard to see if they could save some of these men who they figured probably were lashed to the rigging, just hoping for the best, hoping they could survive the afternoon of Sunday the 27th. So when I talk about a dory, I'm talking about something small like that. Now imagine something small like that, and we got 20-foot waves and 30-foot waves. It's almost unbelievable. But they took off, and they start rowing as mad as they can, because they saw a distress signal right off Martha's Vineyard, and that was from a schooner called the Hamilton. They got out to the Hamilton. Nobody knew how they did it. They would disappear in a trough, then they come back up, they disappear in a trough. But they got out to the Hamilton, they rescued those guys, they brought them back somehow into Vineyard Haven. And everybody thought, oh, these guys are heroes. And then they said, we're gonna go out again. But the problem is, there's a bunch of people we know are in trouble to windward. We can't get to windward. These are like 60, 70 mile-an-hour winds. How are we gonna row against that? So what they needed was a tugboat. And a tugboat volunteered, we'll tug you guys out with a dory. And you can go against the wind, we'll tug you against the wind, and we'll find those other ships. So the second ship voyage of these three guys on the dory went out, towed by the tugboat. They rescued some more people. They brought them in to Vineyard Haven. And then everybody figured, you guys are heroes, have a beer, relax. And then they said, no, we're going back out. There's people out there in distress. And almost unbelievably, as exhausted as they were, rowing as they had been, they went out, joined by a couple others by this point. They went out off of Martha's Vineyard. They saved some more people, rescued 5 men from a ship called the Thurlow, who otherwise would never have made it through that storm. And all told, they had rescued a dozen people from ships that were going down and where nothing was much left but a little bit of wood and sometimes the mast. And they got a special congressional medal because of that. One of the great stories of selfless devotion to rescue at sea of the Portland Gale. So the storm's raging for 36 hours. You got 40 inches of snow in some places along the coast. This is mostly an offshore event, but it was a full moon. There were heavy tides. There was a storm surge, very heavy snow if you were close to the coast. And it lasted until the late hours of Sunday when it finally abated. So if you put it all together, a shocking about 150 ships went down that Saturday and Sunday. So that made 1898. 1898 was the worst year for shipwrecks in New England history, mostly because of the Portland Gale. There was another gale actually a little earlier where ships went down as well. But this storm itself, this storm alone, counted for almost 150 ships going down into the Atlantic, taking with them nearly 500 people, including somewhere between 192 and 200 passengers and crew members of the Portland. Now in Provincetown, things were a total wreck. Almost all the wharves that have been devoted to fishing were destroyed. Only a couple of them were left. The biggest wharves, Union Wharf and Central Wharf, gone, total losses. And that hastened the end of Provincetown as a major fishing port. They could have rebuilt, but remember they were losing profits anyway to bigger commercial trawlers that needed bigger harbors. It would have been difficult to borrow money. Would it have been really worth it to restore all those wharves? And that's why Provincetown, in the ensuing years after the Portland Gale, was under a pressing need to reinvent itself. Commercial fishing, still possible, still existed, but would never promise the profits of the past again. And it's no accident, perhaps, that a second art school was established in Provincetown the very next year, 1899, signaling the true beginning of one of the country's great art colonies, the Provincetown Art Colony, boasting at least 300 working artists by 1916, less than 20 years after the Portland Gale. And some of those artists in Provincetown had friends in Lower Manhattan, and they wrote to them and said, you should come up, it's a nice place, including some writers, literary people. And that's how we got the Provincetown Players, the Provincetown Playhouse, and a pipeline between Provincetown and Greenwich Village that nobody would have imagined in 1870, but was now going to give rise to some of the great artistic achievements of the 20th century. Fishing would never quite disappear from Provincetown. You can still see lobster boats tied up at the McMillan Wharf to this day. But of course, it would never be the same again. It's a different Provincetown. The Portland Gale, go over here, leaving on, that's okay. The Portland Gale also accelerated the shift on ocean-going vessels from side-wheelers to stern-wheelers. It is impossible to deny now how dangerous in a very heavy gale those side-wheelers could be. So you didn't see many of them out in the ocean, not after 1898. And the other big reform that was made was after the Portland Gale, no shipping company ever failed to keep a manifest of passengers and crew on land. They're not just going to send everything on the ship. How else would you know who was on board? So now shipping companies routinely keep manifests on land, copies of them, as well as on board. And as far as the Portland is concerned, it was discovered, the wreck was discovered about 30 years ago. And they don't want to tell you exactly where it is. They don't want divers going down there and taking artifacts out. A bunch of artifacts did wash ashore in Cape Cod. And there are Cape Cod families to this day who have stuck with the Portland in their parlors that they'll show you if they think you're not from the government wanting to take it back. But the wreck is somewhere probably around here. This part is Stellwagen Bank. That's where it ended up, the wreck of the Portland. And ultimately, as far as side-wheelers go, you're not going to have one out of the Atlantic, but you can still take a vacation on a side-wheeler if you want. And that's the Loire Princess. So if you want to go on the Loire River in a side-wheeler, perfectly okay, perfectly safe. I recommend it. But you would not want to be on that one in 30-foot waves. Trust me. And we know that because of the Portland Gale. And that's the very first of our stories of great New England disasters. We'll go to an even greater storm, although the loss of life was comparable, and that was the hurricane of 1938. We're gonna go to that next week, and that will conclude our presentation for today. So, thanks. Again, I commend this book if I read more about it. Don Wilding, Cape Cod, in the Portland Gale. Now, any questions or comments? Any complaints by the meteorologist? Yeah, go ahead.
Was the fate of the Priscilla?
Oh, you know what happened? So the Priscilla, the Commonwealth, the Fall River Line, they, as far as I know, they were never in any kind of a major weather event that hurt them at all. None of them ever sank. They were doing perfectly well. The 19-teens, 1920s, still very popular. Even in the Great Depression, the 1930s, that was the way to go. People loved these ships. And they might still be around today, except what happened was in 1937, I think, there was a major labor stoppage, a major strike that deprived them of some of their best business in the height of the tourist season. And once the strike was settled, they only came back for maybe a year or so after that, and it was never the same, and they went out of business. And it's too bad because that would have been a great way to go. I'd love to have gone on one of those high boats. Yeah?
Two questions.
Yes.
One is the definition of the gale, and the second is, you said the Portland left the Indian Wharf in Boston, it was headed north to Athens?
Portland.
Oh, to Portland, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And so instead of going north, it went south, and is that true? And was it a 2-hour time? The clock stopped, if they left at 7 in the evening, the clock stopped at,
Oh, 9:15 a.m.
they left 9:15 a.m.
But they left it after 7
in the evening.
in the evening, and then the clock stopped at 9:15 a.m.
9:15 a.m. But it was one direction.
They're going this way.
Yeah.
And probably it was so bad out there that maybe he decided to turn back and go south.
That sounds right.
But it could be that the wind blew them back. We'll never know. As far as the definition of a gale is concerned, we have an expert. Can you tell, now I actually read the definition of a gale, but I forgot. So maybe you could tell us.
In this case, it's referring to just a very strong wind, hurricane force winds.
Yeah.
It was not storms of tropical watch. So gale force winds are typically, I'm trying to remember.
What? Because there is a definition.
There is a gale force wind, it's about 40 to 60 mile an hour.
Yeah, I think I remember. That's what I thought.
Something like that. I confess I'm a climate scientist.
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, I confess I'm mute. So. It's a cyclonic storm going up the coast, but it wasn't like the perfect storm. Remember the perfect storm of 1991? That was really different because the perfect storm of 1991 was a nor'easter combined with a hurricane. This was not a hurricane because it didn't begin off by Cape Verde Islands. It didn't begin anywhere near over there as a depression. So it's a totally different kind of weather system, not a hurricane. I don't think we're talking about the perfect storm anymore, but I do want to mention that it wasn't the same kind of system. Yeah.
So the USS Portland has sails, and I was wondering when you would use them.
Well, that was routine. Any kind of a steamship, especially late 19th century, early 20th century, they very often had sails as well. And sometimes if it's nice and breezy, you don't want to waste coal, you're making pretty good progress, why not just use wind power? What if you worry about the boiler exploding? Well, you're dead, exploding. But what if you worry about the boiler failing? You always make sails. So that was almost always happened. Steamships would have sails back.
And this one would not, because it has to get under purchase, like,
Oh yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, because they're on the rivers, so they're going to be just steam power. Yeah, going out of this too, right? Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering what happened to the Portland shipping.
They didn't go belly up after this. They continued for several years, and they ran a profit. They had another ship. They had a sister ship. I can't remember what the name of it was. That was going to go from Portland to Boston the next day. And that ship stayed in business. That ship was fine. And I think they actually built another ship, and they stayed in business for several years. But they failed before the Fall River Line did. I'm not sure what the circumstances were, but I think they persisted into the 1920s, if I remember right. Yes.
In addition to Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket's even farther out. Were they impacted by the Portland gale?
I haven't heard many stories about Nantucket. The stories I keep hearing about at the Cape and Martha's Vineyard, I can't believe they would have missed it. Because their shows are terrible. The shows were on Nantucket. So I gotta believe that there would have been some trouble there, but I just didn't come across any particular stories about it. So, with that as an unfortunate last response. We can adjourn, and I hope to see you all for the Great Hurricane of 1938.
Sure, we want to go next month. We're going on a trip. Oh, what line? But we didn't know we.
This time.
Yeah.
It's like nights.
I don't have that, but we stayed up there one.
The reason I mentioned it is those 10
Why not?